Crystallize. It's definitely a reaction of all time, but let's not lie to ourselves, it is in desperate need of a rework, and I will be talking about ideas I've had for how to improve the reaction and make it meta. Hopefully. Welcome to Genshin What If. Whether it's reworks or concepts, this series talks about the hypotheticals in Genshin Impact. In the past, I've made a video discussing the implications of making shatter an amplifying reaction. While it's a much needed buff, I did include my view that it wouldn't be enough to bring Physical and Geo out from rock bottom. Pun absolutely intended. Today, I have compiled a list of ideas on how to rework Crystallize, and from there we can open up the floor to more discussion. I'm gonna skip my usual disclaimers in the video and instead ask you to check the description for that. Please be sure to read it, especially if you plan to comment. I will know if you didn't. The concept of reworking weak reactions is something the community has talked about for a long time. There's a high chance that what I share in this video may have already been talked about somewhere else. I mean, if you go on Reddit, there's hundreds of these crystallized reworks every week. So the market for original ideas is stretched very thin. As a little shout out, I want to direct your attention to this video by Le Odster. I hope I pronounced that right. They ended up discussing reworking Crystallize as well, and I think it's a great video to check out. Some of my ideas ended up overlapping with theirs, but for the most part, we had different approaches on this rework. If you're interested in seeing some alternate ideas for Crystallize reworks, I'll leave a link to their video in the description. Before we start talking about the rework, let's talk about the current state of Crystallize and why it's bad. As it stands, Crystallize works as such. When Geo is applied to an enemy who is affected by Pyro, Cryo, Hydro, or Electro, a cute little shard will appear on the ground, and when you pick it up, you get a cute little shield. The element that corresponds with the shield provides an increased damage absorption of that element. For example, a Hydro shield will take less damage from Hydro damage. Since it's always the Geo element that is the trigger, the health of the shield will always scale off the Geo user's EM. This isn't that big of an issue, but the matter is that basically no Geo character wants to build EM, since it doesn't mesh well with their kit. This means that most crystallized shields are weak, and do very little to protect you from harm, which kinda defeats the purpose of a shield. And when you pick up a new shard, it simply replaces the old one. So even if you pick up multiple, the health will be the same flimsy number. There is an exception, which is picking up a Geo shard dropped by Geo Bishops or the Geo Hypostasis. But these are mainly overworld situations, and it's an enemy-specific trait, not character-based. This basically means your two options are to either build EM on your Geo character and sacrifice whatever their normal kit scales off, or you build them how they're generally intended to be built as, and then you end up with a shield that doesn't give much survivability. Instead of a single change, I will be presenting multiple ideas, and from there, you can decide which ones you like. First and foremost, Crystallize is a defensive reaction. So my suggestions for offensive utility will remain weaker in comparison to other reactions. This is just for the sake of balancing. I will be sharing three main concepts for Crystallize reworks. One is an EM scaling change, the other is non-EM scaling, and the third is a completely different set of reactions that are really just here for creative fun. Let's go on to the first one. The Quicken reaction, in addition to Shenhe and Yunjin, opened up a new avenue to how damage bonuses worked. Instead of providing a damage percent bonus or multiplicative bonus, they simply add a larger value to the base damage of any character's attacks. This variant of a crystallized reaction would do the same thing. When the character is protected by a crystallized shield, the party will gain an additive damage bonus of the corresponding and Geo element. This bonus scales on the triggering character's EM. In other words, the Geo character's EM. The effect will linger for an additional 5 seconds if the shield breaks or is replaced by a different element. I mentioned earlier that this offensive bonus should be weaker in comparison to other reactions. Where the Quicken reaction uses a 1.5 and 1.25 multiplier for Aggravate and Spread, respectively, Crystallized multipliers would be something like 0.75. A hypothetical full EM build would only give about 3000 bonus damage, but keep in mind, you're also getting around 4600 shield points with one shard. The multiplier I chose is subjective, but the main idea is that we should be trying to balance damage and defense. A mono-elemental team can have better consistency with this bonus since they'll always have the same elemental shield giving them that damage bonus. Meanwhile, multi-elemental teams may be hopping back and forth between different shields. so maintaining a specific elemental bonus will be a bit harder. The upside for this is that EM is now a viable stat for Geo characters, as its scaling allows you to produce more damage for your characters. Finally, those subset roles can have more use. The main con goes back to the lack of EM scaling that Geo characters have in their kits. This is going to result in divergence in your builds, as you'd be making a decision between personal scalings or team support. It's not an inherently bad thing, as we have a lot of characters who can be built in very different ways. But some people spend a lot of time building their Geo characters, so it might be a pain having to refarm for a completely separate build. The alternative idea for offensive utility is something similar to Zhongli's shield. His shield emits an aura that reduces all enemy resistance by 20%. So for a Crystallized shield, it could be a weaker version, like a 10% res shred only for Geo and the Crystallized element. Similarly to the first idea, it lasts for an additional 5 seconds after the shield breaks or is replaced by another element. This, compared to the other idea, is a lot weaker in offensive utility. 10% shred is nothing compared to a damage bonus. So, I propose that since the offensive utility is weaker, we make sure that the defensive utility is stronger. In addition to a res shred, we allow the player to stack their crystallized shields. It's kind of like Toma's shield stacking. Every time you pick up a new shard, you simply build up the shield health even more. Shield health is once again subjective, but I'm gonna say 8,000 max points just to set the bar. I'm trying to make it strong, but not as strong as dedicated shielders. It also doesn't matter if the shields are different elements, the health will still stack, it's just that the absorption bonus will change based on the element. The pros and cons are completely opposite of the previous idea. The pros with this change is that you can keep your Geo characters exactly as they are and still have a good supportive ability with the reaction. Albedo can keep his damage build, Zhongli can have his HP build, etc, etc. The only thing that matters with their kit is if they can trigger consistent crystallizes. The main con is that because there's no scaling with this damage bonus, then EM is still a useless stat, especially since the aforementioned stacking mechanic would require running that stat even less. I'm sure some of you might be wondering, why did I suggest a res shred instead of a damage percent bonus for the non-EM idea? It's because we already have Archaic Petra, which provides a 35% damage bonus for the element we crystallize, but no one talks about that because it can only be triggered when the user is on field. So, simple solution. Add a sentence at the end saying, "This effect can now be triggered off-field." It's an indirect buff to crystallize, and it would create a whole new incentive for you to actually run a Geo character on this set. And if you combine that with either of the reworks I suggested earlier, these bonuses start adding up and the reaction becomes a lot more viable. Next thing to address is the inclusion of Dendro Crystallizing. One of the complaints I saw when Dendro first came out was that it doesn't react with Cryo, Anemo, or Geo. Looking at how Dendro teams work now, I can kind of see the appeal. Not reacting with these elements gives the player team flexibility to add those elements to their comps. By being inert, we don't have to worry about certain reactions getting messed up. It is worth considering whether it might be beneficial for Dendro and Geo to react. I say it's very dependent on your team comp. If you had slow Dendro and fast Geo application, reactions definitely could get messed up. But if it's vice versa, then not much is really going to change from what we have now. Personally, I'm whatever about these elements mixing, but I figured it would be an important thing to briefly cover. On to the last section of the video, which is a complete shift from what we've been talking about so far. There are some people who believe that Geo Reactions should have completely different effects based on the element it reacts with. Before I share my ideas on separate reactions, I should discuss the implications of making this kind of change. For the record, it's mostly bad. We have a lot of reactions already, and adding 5 or 6 more at once could be a lot to take in, especially for new or returning players. Next, it's very possible that implementing completely new reactions could completely mess up the current reaction system we have, and in turn, mess up some team comps. Finally, having a completely separate effect means that Geo technically triggers 2 reactions at once. I'd make the argument that if we were to have new Geo reactions, then Crystallize would be removed altogether. That's my view from a game development standpoint, but from a creative standpoint, it'll be fun to come up with ideas for separate Geo reactions. So, I'll share my list of ideas in a speedrun fashion. Pyro and Geo triggers Blaze. Upon triggering Blaze, an explosion is created which spreads molten rock on the ground for a set time. Kind of like Signora's ability in the boss fight. Enemies who walk on it become constantly afflicted with pyro and take consistent pyro damage. This pyro application is very fast and would actually be fast enough for the player to trigger forward vaporizes. Cryo and Geo make Avalanche. This is very similar to Blaze, in which an explosion of cryo occurs, leaving behind a field of frost. Enemies who walk through it take consistent cryo damage and are affected by cryo. The damage would be lower than that of Blaze's field, since it balances out with the passive speed reduction cryo auras have. But just like Blaze, Avalanche applies cryo fast enough to where the player could trigger forward melts. Hydro and Geo equals Erode. This will shred the target enemy's defense by 5% for 15 seconds. If you deal another instance of Erode before the 15 seconds are up, it will refresh the cooldown and stack that effect. This will stack up to 4 times for a max of 20% defense shred. All stacks are lost if the duration expires. Electro and Geo causes Magnetize. The target enemy is afflicted with a Magnetize aura. Any nearby enemies affected by Electro are slowly drawn towards the magnetized enemy. This is a good crowd control reaction that doesn't require Anemo. If multiple enemies have the magnetized aura, then their combined auras cause the effect to be stronger. Magnetized auras are similar to Electro auras, so any elements that can react to Electro will react to Magnetize. Root is the next reaction, which is Dendro and Geo. There's no damage at all with this reaction, so EM is negligible, but we have what is basically an alternate version of Freeze. Vines grow from the ground, which ensnare the enemies in place. Smaller enemies will be affected longer than larger enemies. Flying enemies can still be ensnared, but they'll remain airborne. And the ensnared enemies are affected with a rooted aura, which is basically the equivalent of a Dendro aura. So you can use that opportunity to trigger some Dendro reactions, but you'd likely lose the ensnarement in the process. Finally, we have Anemo and Geo. This utility rework implies making it so that Anemo and Geo can exist to proc a reaction. It's called Blind, and it works like a Sandstorm. It deals a small instance of EM scaling damage, and it works similarly to how Tighnari's field works. The enemy affected with Blind will basically attack randomly instead of you specifically, so you can keep them off your trail. I think that's basically it for this video. Let me know in the comments which method of a Geo rework you would like to see. Which one did you like the best? If you liked the video, consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, and checking out some of the other videos. I'll see you next time. Bye!